Shvi'is Perek Hey Mishnah Aleph. B'noi Shuach Shvi'is Shelahen Shnia. Fruit that emerges on a tree during Shemitah has Kedusha Shvi'is, even if it doesn't ripen until after Shemitah. The Mishnah is going to discuss two examples of such fruit. Fruit that emerges on a tree is the stage known as Chanota, when the petals of the flower fall off. Produce that has Kedusha Shvi'is is subject to a number of restrictions. It must be eaten or consumed in a food-like way, and not be disposed of or used for business purposes. It may not be guarded by the owner of the field in which it grew. Rather, he must let it be taken by anyone. He has to be mafker. In addition, most Shemitah produce requires beer, as we explained a few times already throughout the Masechta. So, B'nai Shuach are white figs. Some maintain that B'nai Shuach are a species of pine with edible cones that was commonly called the white fig tree. So they have their Shemitah in the second year of the 7-year cycle. That is to say, B'nai Shuach that ripen in the second year after Shemitah have the status of Shemitah produce. Shehin oisos l'shalei shanim. This is because they grow over 3 years. Unlike most other fruits, which ripen the year that they emerge, B'nai Shuach take 3 years to ripen. Therefore, those that ripen in the second year after Shemitah must have emerged during Shemitah and are thus subject to Hilchos Shvi'is. On the other hand, B'nai Shuach that ripen during Shemitah do not have Shemitah Kedusha Shvi'is because they must have emerged before Shemitah, which is very interesting comparing it to other types of figs, because we know that Slav is a kind of fruit that grows very quickly, and it's a type of fig tree. So over here, I guess this is a kind of fig that grows very slowly, and we see a big nafka min l'halacha. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Parsois shvius shalahen motzi shvius." Parsois, this too is a species of figs. Other mavarshim suggest that it may be a kind of date. That parsois have their Shemitah in the year after the 7th year. That is, parsois that ripen the year after Shemitah have the status of Shemitah produce, shein oisis l'shtei because they grow over 2 years. Since these fruits take 2 years to grow, those that ripen in the year following Shemitah must have emerged during Shemitah, and therefore have Kedusha Shvi'is. Amr Loi, the Chachamim argued with Rabbi Yehuda, and they said, Loi Amr Ela B'nai Shuach. It was not stated that a crop that ripens after Shemitah has the status of Shemitah produce, except in regard to white figs. Only in the case of white figs was the Torah that fruit ripening after Shemitah is subject to Hilchos Shvi'is. Regarding all other fruits, including parsois, that which ripens during Shemitah has the Kedusha Shvi'is, and that which ripens after Shemitah does not. In contrast to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that most parsois ripen in the year after they emerge, the Chachamim maintain that most parsois ripen that same year. Mishnah Beis, Hataymin es haluf b'shvi'is. The next few Mishnayos discuss a certain type of onion called aluf. Rashi in Shabbos and elsewhere identifies luf as a type of bean. The Rav, though, learned that it's a type of onion. After being picked, it's buried in the ground to preserve it for use in the future. The Chachamim were geyser that since burying luf looks like an act of planting, which is also during Shvi'is, one may not bury luf during Shemitah except under certain conditions. So, Hataymin luf b'shvi'is, if one buries luf during Shemitah, Remeir says that he must meet the following conditions. Li'ivches misasayim, he may not bury less than 2 saw, which is 12 kav of luf in a single hole. Ad goyva shlosha tvachim, he must pile it up to a height of at least 3 tvachim in the hole. V'tefach offer al gabav, and he must put at least a tefach of dirt on top of it. Since luf bulbs are planted by scattering them around, piling many of them together in a tall heap shows that they are being stored and not planted. Furthermore, burying them under a tefach of dirt shows that they are being stored and not planted, because when something is planted, it is covered by just a thin layer of dirt. But the Chachamim say, he may not bury less than 4 kav of luf in a single hole, as opposed to the 12 kav required by Rav Meir. Ad goyva tefach, he must pile it up to a height of at least 1 tefach, as opposed to the 3 tefachim required by Rav Meir. Tefach offer al gavav, he must put at least a tefach of dirt on top of it, as Rav Meir holds. With time to b'makom drisas adam, and he must bury it in a place upon which people tread. The constant trampling of people on the ground above the luf prevents it from sprouting. Therefore, burying it in such a place shows that he did not intend to plant it. Mishnah Gimel. Luf she'avra luf shvi'is. The roots of the luf plant remain viable for a long time, which allows its leaves to continue growing from one year to the next. The Mishnah deals with a luf plant that produced leaves on Shemitah, and they grew further into the 8th year. Thus, in the 8th year, the leaves are a mixture of 7th year growth, which has Kedusha Shvi'is, and the 8th year growth, which does not. So luf she'avra luf shvi'is, if luf grew past Shemitah, produced leaves during Shemitah, and then continued growing in the 8th year, Rabbi Lezer Omer imloktu v'aniyim es olav loktu. The halach is that if the poor picked all its leaves during Shemitah, they have indeed picked them, meaning all the leaves belong to them. Since they picked all the Shemitah growths themselves, the owner of the field does not give any to them. But if the poor didn't pick all its leaves during Shemitah, the owner must make an accounting with the poor. That is, he has to reckon what proportion of the remaining leaves grew during Shemitah and give that proportion to them. Meaning, because he has to be mafkir, even though he wasn't mafkir yet already. Rabbi Shua says, "Im loktu aniyim is olav loktu, v'mlav ein la'aniyim olav cheshbon." If the poor picked all its leaves during Shemitah, they have indeed picked them. All the leaves are theirs. But if they did not pick its leaves during Shemitah, the poor have no accounting with the owner. That is, the poor have a right only to what they actually picked during Shemitah, and not to anything that they did not pick. Thus, even though some portion of the leaves currently on the plant have kedusha shvius, the owner does not have to give any of it to the poor. In order to understand the Mishnah, it's necessary to know some of the halachas of beer that apply during Shemitah. A person may pick limited amounts of produce on Shemitah and keep them in his house for the use of himself and his family, as long as the type of produce can still be found in the fields for wild animals to eat. Once the species is no longer available outdoors to wild animals, he is forbidden to keep any of that species in his house. At this point, he must perform the process of beer, in which he gives up his rights to the ownership of the produce and puts it outside his house for anyone to take. In the 9th parak, his machlekes Tanaim about who may take Shemitah produce after the beer. Rabbi Yehuda maintains that it may be taken only by the poor, while Rabbi Yossi holds that it may be taken by anyone, even the owner himself. This is in contrast to the period before beer, when everyone agrees that Shemitah produce is available to everyone, rich and poor alike. So the Tanakam of our Mishnah, the first Tana in our Mishnah rather, Rabbi Lezer, agrees with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that only the poor can take the produce after beer, whereas the original owner may not. That the leaves that grew on the luf plant during Shemitah are now mechuyev in beer, but belong entirely to the poor and no one else. The owner is entitled only to that which grew in the 8th year. The owner must therefore calculate the proportion of the leaves currently on the plant that grew in Shemitah, as opposed to the proportion that grew in the 8th year, and give the Shemitah proportion to the poor while he keeps the rest. Rabbi Shua, the next Tana, agrees with Rabbi Yossi's view that even the owner himself can take back the produce after beer. Accordingly, any leaves that the poor did not pick during Shemitah become the property of the owner, and he does not have to give any to them. The love plant being discussed here was uprooted by the owner during Shemitah before the Zman beer and brought it into his house. Then, when the beer deadline arrived, he removed it from his house and put it out for everyone to take, as he's mechuyev to do. The love took root again when it was left outside and restarted growing leaves in the 8th year. So, as explained before, Rabbi Lezer holds that whatever grew during Shemitah, even that which the poor did not pick, became their property when the beer was done. Became their property when the beer was done, meaning the aniyim, whereas Rabbi Shua maintains that the owner may take it for himself. Regarding vegetables, the question of whether they are Shemitah produce or not is determined by the year in which they are picked. In our case, since the plant was uprooted in Shemitah, it is indeed Shemitah produce, even though it was replanted and then uprooted again in the 8th year. Okay, Mishnah Daled. Luf shel erev shvius shenichnas l'shvius. The Mishnah deals with the halacha of luf and similar plants that finished growing in the 6th year, but remained in the ground until the 7th. Generally, a vegetable is defined as belonging to the year in which it was picked. However, this rule applies only where it also grew a little bit that year. If it completely finished growing the year before, it did not grow at all the year it was picked, it has the status of the year in which it grew. In our Mishnah's case, therefore, the luf and other vegetables are not Shemitah produce, even though they were dug up during Shemitah, because their entire growth took place in the 6th year. So, in order to obtain the root of the plant, which is edible, one must dig into the ground. The Chachamim were concerned that someone who digs up these plants during Shemitah would appear to be working on the land. Digging in the soil softens it, which makes it better for planting, which is also during Shvius. They were geyser, therefore, that one is forbidden to dig up luf and similar plants on Shemitah, except if you do it in an unusual way. So, luf shel erev shvius and nichnas l'shvius, regarding luf that completed its growth in the 6th year but was still rooted in the ground when Shemitah began, chen b'tzalim ha-kitzonim, as well as summer onions. I guess kitzonim is a lashon of kayetz. This is a type of onion that's planted in early summer and picked in the summer. V'chen pua shel idis, and madder that grew in fertile soil. The root of the madder were used to madder, M-A-D-D-E-R, were used to produce a red dye. The Mishnah specifies that it is growing in fertile soil in order to distinguish it from the pua that grows in rocky ground, in which case the law is different, as we're going to see. The Mishnah refers to summer onions and pua that grew completely in the 6th year and were dug up during Shemitah, like the luf mentioned earlier. So Beishamai say Eikrin Eisa b'marufa shel eitz. One may uproot them during Shemitah only with wooden spades. It's forbidden to use a metal spade that's ordinarily used for this purpose, because that would appear like working the land. To avoid giving this impression, one must depart from the ordinary method and use a wooden spade instead, to use some sort of shinoi, so it shouldn't look like he's working on the land. Beis Hillel, I remember Beis Hillel said, one may uproot these plants even with a pickaxe. Art Scroll actually teaches Kardumish Matches mataks, M-A-T-T-O-C-K-S. It's a kind of pickaxe. A matak has two blades, one that is broad and one that is pointed. The broad blade is used by woodcutters for chopping down trees, and the pointed blade is used for splitting wood into smaller pieces. Unlike Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel permit one to use a metal tool. Nevertheless, even Beis Hillel require a small change from the ordinary method, so they permit only a kardumas shel matches and not a spade of matches, an axe, not a spade. The Mishnah refers specifically to plants that grew entirely in the 6th year. Had they continued to grow in the 7th year and become Shemitah produce, one would not be allowed to dig them up at all, because digging up these plants in an unusual manner will damage them, and it's forbidden to damage Shemitah produce. And Beis Shammai agree in the case of pua that grows in rocky ground. Tzela is generally like sloim. It's rocky, choppy ground. It's not smooth ground. So even Beis Shammai agree that one may uproot it even with a metal pickaxe. Since rocky ground is not usually planted, people are unlikely to think that the farmer is working the land. Therefore, all agree that karduma shel matches is mutter. Even in this case, a metal spade is still going to be aser. Mishnah Hey, even after the 8th year has begun, one may not buy produce from an Amaretz. Since an Amaretz is suspected of failing to observe the Hilchah Shemitah properly, the produce he's selling might have been treated unlawfully during Shemitah. For example, the produce may have come from a field that had been guarded to prevent the public from entering. It's forbidden to buy Shemitah produce that was not made available to the public. The Isser remains in place until the 8th year crop of the same type of produce has grown and is being sold in the market, at which point one can assume that what the Amaretz is selling is not Shemitah produce but belongs to the 8th year. The Mishnah cites a machlekes as to whether the luf plant is an exception to this law. So, when is a person permitted to buy luf in the year after Shemitah from an Amaretz? Rabbi Yehuda says miyad. One might buy it immediately after Shemitah because it presumably grew in the year before Shemitah. The Yerushalmi explains that the Mishnah refers to luf that was taken from a storage pile and was not newly uprooted. A person who buys such luf at the beginning of the 8th year does not know whether it was uprooted in the 7th year, in which case it would have Shemitah sanctity, Kedusha Shvius, or whether it was uprooted in the 6th year, in which case it would not have Kedusha Shvius. Rabbi Yehuda argues that it was unlikely to have been uprooted during Shemitah because, as told in the previous Mishnah, uprooting luf during Shemitah must be done in an unusual manner, which makes the task more difficult. Even people who are over the Isurim Shvius will not uproot luf in the usual manner during Shemitah because they're afraid to violate Shemitah openly, lest they be caught and be punished. We may assume, therefore, that the seller uprooted it before Shemitah when he was allowed to use the normal tools. If it was still attached to the ground when Shemitah began, he would not have gone to the trouble of uprooting it during Shemitah in order to store it for eventual sale after Shemitah. Rather, he would have left it in the ground until after Shemitah when uprooting it is easier. However, it is also to buy luf during Shemitah itself. In that case, the buyer must be concerned that the seller uprooted it during Shemitah, because a person would go through the trouble of digging up luf with unusual tools if he intends to sell it immediately. If he did not intend to sell it until the 8th year, he would have delayed uprooting it until then, when the task would be easier. One may buy it only from the 8th year crop of luf, when the new crop is abundant. According to the Chachamim, luf is treated the same as all other produce. As such, the buyer must worry that the luf being offered for sale as Shemitah produce until the 8th year crop is available in the market. Mishnah Vav. Elu kelim she'enhu uman rasha l'machar b'shvius. The Torah says, "L'fnei iver le'site mirshel." Before a blind man, you shall not place a stumbling block. The Chachamim explained that this is an isser against helping someone be over any avera. He's a blind man in the sense that he has been blinded by his urge to do an avera. For this reason, it's also to sell certain items during Shemitah to an Amaretz, since he's suspected of not keeping the Hilchah Shvius. He may use them illegally against the Torah. So elu kelim she'einu mon rasha l'meichim b'shvius. These are the farming tools that a craftsman may not sell to an Amaretz during Shemitah. Machresha v'chol keleho v'hamizre v'hadeker, a plow and all its accessories, a yoke to harness an animal to a plow, a winnowing fork, and a hoe. After the process of threshing, in which the kernels of grain are removed from their husks, the act of winnowing is performed. A large winnowing fork is used to throw the mixture of kernels and chaff, which is the husks, stems, and leaves, into the air. The wind blows away the lighter chaff, while the heavier kernels fall straight down. Winnowing is generally permitted during Shemitah, since one is allowed to reap produce on Shemitah, then process it, which includes the activities of threshing, winnowing, and the like. However, even these activities are mutter only on a small scale. One may not process a large amount at one time. It is thus forbidden to sell a winnowing fork to an Amaretz because this tool is used only for large amounts of grain. A deker is a hoe, which is a metal tool used for digging. Since these tools are used only for work that is also during Shemitah, the Amaretz will presumably use them for that purpose. Thus, selling them to him on Shemitah is forbidden because one thereby helps him do an Aveira. One may, however, sell these items to someone who's Shemer Shemitah because he presumably intends to use them during the 8th year. But one may sell a hand sickle, which is used for cutting a handful of stalks at a time, as we saw in Peah, or a magul katzir, a reaping sickle. This is an ordinary full-size sickle used to harvest produce. It can also be used to cut just a small amount. The agala, and a wagon and all its accessories, even to an amaretz, because we're allowed to assume that he'll use these objects for their permitted purposes. The buyer could use the sickles to reap a small amount of Shemitah produce and then bring the produce home in the wagon. These activities are permitted because a person is allowed to reap enough produce for the immediate needs of his family. It is forbidden only to harvest a large amount that will be stored for several days. Since these tools have a permitted use, one may sell them even to a person who cannot be trusted to observe the laws of Shvius properly. Although it is forbidden to provide someone with an object he will use to commit a transgression, that issur is limited to objects with whose only use is against halacha. One may sell him an item that has a permitted use as well, besides for the issur, provided that there's a reasonable chance that he will use it for the davar hamutter and not just for the davar ha'asr. Zahaklal, this is the rule. Kol shemalachtim yuchedes la'avera asr. Any tool that's designated only for transgressing an issur is forbidden to be sold. But a tool that's designated for both something that's forbidden and something that's permitted is permitted to be sold because chances are that he'll use it for a davar hamutter also, not just for a davar ha'asr. Mishnah Zayin. A potter may sell up to 5 empty oil jugs and 15 empty wine jugs to an amaretz shekain darkel havim in a hefker, because that's the amount of wine or oil one would typically bring home from ownerless property. The Chachamim estimated that when picking from ownerless property, a person would not take more than the amount of olives that produce 5 jugfuls of oil and the amount of grapes that produce 15 jugfuls of wine. The only way for him to exceed those amounts would be to harvest produce from a field close to the public, which is asr. Since anyone can take Shemitah produce from private fields, many people compete for the produce of each field. Therefore, no one person can obtain an excessive amount unless he commits the sin of taking from fields whose owners prevent the public from entering. Thus, in order to avoid helping someone sin, one may not sell more than 5 oil jugs and 15 wine jugs to someone who cannot be trusted with hilchos shvius. We are not concerned that he will use all 20 jugs for oil or all of them for wine, because oil jugs and wine jugs are made from different materials and are not interchangeable. But if the buyer brought home more than this, meaning more than the amount of produce that would fill 5 oil jugs and 15 wine jugs, it's mutter to sell him the amount of jugs that he needs after he had already collected large amounts of produce. You don't suspect him of having done so against halacha. The halacha is that before Amaretz goes out to take Shemitah produce, we're afraid that he might take something from close fields against halacha, and so one may not sell too many jugs to him. After he has already brought home large amounts of produce, however, we don't suspect him of having obtained this illegally, especially in view of his insistence that he didn't break the halacha. At this point, then, one may sell him as many jugs as he wants. And one may sell more than 5 oil jugs and 15 wine jugs to goyim in Eretz Yisrael, because we're not afraid that they'll resell them to a Am Haaretz. Well, Yisrael b'chutz la'aretz, one may also sell more than this number of jugs to a Jew outside the land, even if he's Am Haaretz, because we're not afraid that he'll bring them to Eretz Yisrael and use them there to store produce that was taken illegally against halacha. Mishnah Ches. One may not sell him an Amaretz a plowing cow, a cow trained to pull a plow on Shemitah, because he'll definitely use it for plowing. Bishil matirin, Bishil ruled that selling such a cow is mutter because the buyer can slaughter it. Since it's possible that the buyer wants to slaughter the cow, the seller may assume that this is indeed the bar's intent. As long as there's a reasonable possibility that the bar will use this item for a permitted purpose, one's allowed to sell it to him. Beis Hillel agree that the 4 tools mentioned in the beginning of Mishnah Vav may not be sold because they're used only for work that's also during Shemitah. Beis Shammai, on the other hand, forbids selling the cow because they hold that no one would slaughter a cow that was specially trained to pull a plow. There's a Gemara Baba Kama, I think it's the beginning of the 5th parak, that it's very clear when somebody's buying a cow what the purpose is, and there were different types of cows, so to speak. The ones that you would want to plow, you would want to make it stronger, more muscular to be able to work better, and the ones that you wanted it to for shchita, you would fatten it up in a different way to make it better to eat. So it's not the same thing. It's almost like the difference between the kadeh yain and the kadeh shemen, that they're not, like we explained from the Rav, that they're talking not the same thing. So you're not going to take 20, just like you're not going to take 20 jugs, the person's not going to mix up the different types of cows. That's at least according to Beis Shammai. Okay. One may sell him produce even during the planting season, because instead of planting the produce which is forbidden, he might eat it. Beis Shammai agree with this ruling, because it's possible that the bar will eat the produce. This is unlike the case of the cow trains for plowing, which people will certainly not shecht and eat. And one may lend him one saw measure, even though one knows that he has a threshing floor, because instead of using it to measure Shemitah produce for storage, which is usher, he might use it to measure produce for grinding, which is mutter. Generally, one who measures produce on the threshing floor plans to store it, while one who measures produce in his house intends to eat it. The Mishnah teaches that although the buyer has a threshing floor, he will not necessarily use the measuring cup for the purpose of knowing how much produce he is storing, which is forbidden, because Shemitah produce must be used and not stored. Instead, he might use the cup in order to know how much he is grinding. One may change ma'ois into prutas, coin to greater value for coin to less value, means to change them up for him, even though one knows that he has workers who did work in his land on Shemitah, which is aser, because instead of using the money to pay them, he may use the money for a permitted purpose. He'll go to the store and buy himself potato chips. But all of these transactions are forbidden if the buyer states explicitly that he wants them for the prohibited activity. So really, this whole shmooze is all about lifnei iver. So it's very, because it's an isser that's difficult for people to follow, because it's something that they're so accustomed to, and then now in the 7th year they have to stop. So that's why we have all these halachas that, how much it goes into lifnei iver. Which is interesting, because even Hilchos Shabbos, the Shulchan Aruch starts off discussing Hilchos Shabbos, all kinds of things that would be also for the, to do before Shabbos, like the Gemara also discusses, but there's a big discussion of all the different halachas of what's mutter and what's not, of, what somebody might do over Shabbos, from before Shabbos going into Shabbos, if he's not used to it. Fine, Mishnah Tes. Mashalas isha lechaverta hachshuda ala shvius. The previous Mishnah discusses selling and lending animals and farming tools to those whose Shemitah observance is suspect. This Mishnah discusses lending them household utensils. A woman may lend these utensils to her friend who is suspected of violating Hilchos Shemitah. She is suspected of keeping Shemitah produce after the beer deadline without performing beer. Produce that did not undergo beer is also to be eaten. So nava, ukvara, v'rechayim, v'tanor. A sifter, which separates fine flour from coarse flour. A sieve, which separates chaff from grain. I always say that the way to remember is a nafa with a fei is a sifter with an F, and kavara is with a vase, is with a sieve, which separates chaff from grain. It's two different things. One's obviously finer than the other. A nafa is finer, again with a fei, and more coarse is kavara, is more coarse. Rechaim is a mill which grinds grain into flour. V'tanor, and an oven that's permitted, even though her friend will probably use these utensils to prepare forbidden Shemitah produce, since there's a chance that she will use them for something that's mutter, one is allowed to lend them to her. The sifter could be used to count money, the sieve could be used to sift sand for use in cement, the mill to grind spices, and the oven to dry up bundles of flax. However, we don't consider the possibility that she will use the utensils to prepare permitted food, because the Mishnah refers to a case where it's known that this woman does not have any food besides for Shemitah produce. To be sure, it is far-fetched to assume that the borrower will use the utensils for these permissible purposes. However, since there is a small chance that she will do so, one is allowed to lend them to her. As the Mishnah will explain below, the reason for this special leniency is to promote peace between the neighbors, as as the Gemara discusses in Gittin in a very similar case, and we mentioned this in the Mishnah Dubai, in a very similar case also. However, she may not sort or grind her French Shemitah produce together with her because she thereby directly assists in preparing the forbidden produce. Actually, it's generally permitted to prepare forbidden Shemitah produce, only eating it's prohibited. Meaning it's normally mutter to prepare things that are also during Shemitah, only eating it's also. Nevertheless, if someone is preparing such produce in order for it to be eaten and another person helps her, the second one would be guilty of assisting in the performance of this Isser of Shvius. Eishes chaver mashelis leishes ha'ma'oretz nafa ukvara ubayreres v'techenes u'markedes ima. The wife of a chaver is someone who carefully observes the laws of Tumah and Maisus, may lend to the wife of an Amaret, someone who does not observe these laws so carefully, nafa ukvara, a sifter and a sieve. Lending her a mill or an oven is also permitted. Ubayreres v'techenes u'markedes ima. She may even sort, grind, and sift the produce together with her. This is permitted even though an Amaret's wife may not take off meiser from the food before it is eaten, and thus they are possibly preparing forbidden food. The Torah prohibits one to eat produce from which the required portions of trumas and meiser have not yet been removed. That would be considered tevel. Most Amei Aretz do in fact take meiser to produce. Thus, according to the Torah, the food is mutter. The Chacham, however, decreed that one may not eat the produce or food of an Amei Aretz before taking off meiser oneself. This is the Isser of Dmai. Since the food is forbidden only midrabanan, the Rabbanan ruled more leniently here than in the Mishnah's previous case of assisting an Amaretz that prepares Shemitah produce. Although they prohibited helping an Amaretz sift and grind Shemitah produce, they allowed helping him or her sift and grind ordinary produce. However, once the Amaretz's wife added water to the flour, one may not help or need it. Leisiga etza literally means to touch with her, but the reason we're going to explain in the Mishnah, because one may not assist those who are doing an avera. When water is mixed into flour, the resulting dough is mechuyev and challah. Challah is a portion that must be separated from the dough and given to a kohen. Once the dough is formed, no part of it may be eaten until challah has been removed. At this point, it's forbidden to make the dough tameh. As long as the dough still contains challah, the dough itself is regarded like challah in many respects. Therefore, just as one is forbidden to make challah tameh, so too is one forbidden to make such a dough tameh. In our case, since the Amaretz's wife and her kalim are presumed to be tameh, she will commit the sin of making the dough tameh as she needs it. The chaver's wife is thus forbidden to help her knead the dough, because this is actively assisting her in the transgression of being metameh the dough. The Mishnah has permitted three things. Number one, lending utensils to a woman who will probably use them to prepare forbidden Shemitah produce. Number two, lending utensils to an Amaretz's wife who will probably use them to prepare food that may be eaten without meiser being taken off. And number three, helping an Amaretz's wife sort, grind, and sift food that may be eaten before meiser is taken off. According to basic halachas, even these acts should be asur because of the isser against helping someone do an avera, misayel de avera. So the Mishnah explains why it's mutter. The Chacham said that all these acts are mutter only for the sake of peace, that is, to limit discrimination against people suspected of being over the Hilchah Shemitah or the halachas of Tumah and Maisus. Nevertheless, even for the sake of peaceful relations, the Chacham were matter only indirect assistance, like lending a sift to receive. They did not allow direct assistance, such as helping to grind or sift the Shemitah produce of an Amaretz and helping to knead the dough of an Amaretz. Furthermore, they are permitted lending utensils only if it's possible, though unlikely that the buyer will use them for permitted purposes. Lending a utensil that has no permitted use is going to be asur. We may give words of encouragement to goyim who are working at their own land in Eretz Yisrael during Shemitah. We mentioned this already in Parak Daled Mishnah Gimel. They're repeated here in connection with the previous statement, which was also made for Mipnei Darkei Shalom. For example, one may say to the goy, be successful or be strong. Since goyim are not mechuyev to keep Hilchah Shemitah, we may encourage them while they work on their fields, though we may not help them. Avalei de Yisrael, we may not encourage a yid who is doing so. On the contrary, we're mechuyev to give him musar and to give him techacha, or to point out to him that he's not following halacha. Obviously, do it in a way that he's going to listen, which is a whole ma'isa how to be mekayim of techacha properly. B'shalom b'shleiman. We may greet goyim by saying shalom, which is one of the shemis of Hashem, even on their holidays. And Pnei Darkei Shalom. These acts are permitted for the sake of peace, to promote peace between Yidden and goyim. If not for the if not for Darkei Shalom, it would be also to encourage a guy to do work that he is forbidden to do. Likewise, it would be also to greet a guy with the word Shalom, which is Nev Hashem on his holiday, because he might then commit the sin of thanking his Avodah Zarah for having received this honor. However, Darkei Shalom, the Chacham allowed these practices. We must always strive for Shalom between Yidden and Goyim, because we follow the ways of Hashem, like it says in Tehillim, the Tov Hashem Lakol V'Rachmol Kol Masav, and also says the Shalom. For this reason, we also support non-Jews who are poor, visit non-Jews who are sick, and bury non-Jews who are in need of burial, because of Darkei HaShalom.